Everybody, we are here. I think it's 6.5 days until Passover starts. So we are making our way throughout the Jewish calendar. So I wanted to, again, just take maybe an hour to do some learning. Really, this will probably end up being a lot more of a review just of some of the major ideas and some of the major sources of Passover that I think are just helpful to have a conversation about beforehand rather than get to the Seder. And it's been a full year since any of us have thought about Passover. The title of this learning session is Universalism and Particularism. And I'll sort of explain the conclusion before we get to the main conversation so everybody can sort of clearly see how I'm trying to frame Passover. And of course, as conversational as this can be, it'd be a lot more fun than me blabbering for an hour. But we have a tension in Judaism that actually a lot of worldviews try to mitigate this tension, where we can imagine worldviews that are extremely universalistic. And what I mean by universalistic are they imagine that they have a correct prescribed worldview that should fit everybody. And so one example of this, obviously, in the religious realm is there are plenty of religious traditions, right? Islam, Christianity, right? And others who, if you ask a devout believer of that tradition, is this the correct way in which you think all 7 billion people on earth should be living their life? They would say yes, right? Obviously, universalism exists within politics as well, right? One famous or infamous example, right? The philosophy of Marxist philosophy, right? Also prescribes sort of a universalistic framework for how to interact with the world, right? If you ask somebody of that philosophy, should everybody be behind this, right? Is this a worldview that everybody should adopt? They would say, of course, yes. And so to some extent, universalism, I'm defining universalism as you thinking that you have a worldview that applies to everybody, which we can discuss a little bit more in depth, but it comes with its own ethical complications, because on the one hand, all the examples that I gave, you can see very quickly how it ends in at worst, bloodshed and me trying to convince you with force, right? As we know, the history of universalism isn't that great in terms of if I think I have the truth and you don't, right? That basically gives me moral permission to do whatever I want to you in order to convince you of it, which, there's no lack of examples in human history of that. On the other hand, universalism might have some moral pluses, because at the end of the day, if you do think, and if one could argue that you do have truths that everybody else is lacking, then you should actually want to spread those. And one example that I think is more palatable to us than, let's say, Christianity, Islam, or Marxism, of which I would imagine nobody here thinks should be the de facto worldview of the world, is Western liberalism to a large extent. A lot of people do think there are some universalistic ideals, such as, let's say, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, that we might want them to be universal values. On the other hand, there is the ideology of particularism, which is, I'll define as almost a more tribal worldview, where you think your particular brand of whatever you're doing is great, and everybody else in the world, sure, they're doing whatever they're doing, and you don't need to have any interaction with them. It's not that you think they're right or wrong. You just do not want to concern yourself with what's happening outside of your worldview and your tribe, and you are content just being your own group that's completely detached. One example that I could think of, I'm sure there's a myriad of others, is, let's say, when I went to a sleepaway camp that was in Sugar Grove, Pennsylvania, and over the summers that I was in Sugar Grove, Pennsylvania, basically the only people who exist in that city over the summer were this small Jewish sleepaway camp, and there's a huge Amish community there. And so always they have sort of the caretakers of the camp end up being from the Amish community. So I remember having these long conversations with this wider Amish community about their worldview and about, do they think everybody should be Amish? No. Do they think they should continue to be Amish? Of course. And so that has always rung in my head as a particularistic identity. And again, we can see how in some way that's positive, right? In some way it is nice if somebody has a strong worldview, right? It's great that they are sectioning off to the side and saying, well, I believe this is the right way for me to act, but you do you. On the other hand, if you're just particularistic, then you might only care about your own immediate tribe, and you're not coming together to helping the collective good at all. So with that lengthy introduction, one of the ways that I want to frame Judaism as a tradition, but Passover as the most explicit example in our tradition, is a way that, just like a lot of things in Judaism, when faced with a binary choice of worldview, Judaism says, we'll take both. And to a lot of confusion of a lot of people, right? Is Judaism a tradition for Jews, or is Judaism a tradition for everybody? And the answer, of course, is both, albeit in different ways. And what Judaism attempts to do, and I think the Seder and Passover and the worldview behind Passover really sets us up in an interesting way, is Judaism, on the one hand, is a staunchly particularistic tradition. And what I mean by that is, we've never in the history of Judaism had a imperative to go out and forcibly convert or to spread our religion by either might or by trying to convince people, right? There aren't a lot of Jews who are knocking door to door saying, hey, have you seen, the word of God? But on the other hand, Judaism clearly has ethical ideas that we believe should be expressed in the wider world. And usually those ideas are a lot more in the ethical or moral realm than in the ritualistic realm. And so just the last thing I'll say by introduction, and then I'd love to hear some thoughts, and then we'll get some sources out here, is Judaism has this bifurcation between what we might call the particularistic rituals and the universalistic morals. And Judaism does a good job at separating these, right? So let's say, right, eating matzah is a particularistic ritual, right? I don't think anybody here would think that, well, wouldn't it just be so wonderful if all 7 billion people on Earth were going to sit next Wednesday night at dinner and eat a piece of matzah, right? But we probably all would think it would be great if next Wednesday night, all 7 billion people on Earth realize that the wider ethical imperatives that are at the center of the Seder, namely the idea of going from a situation of slavery to freedom and worrying about those who have less in society, and a lot of those ideas, right? We really do think that those would be good to spread to wider society. So I want to explore this tension in our tradition, and sort of explore how I think that the Seder was set up to really try to tease out this idea. Before we go there, any preliminary thoughts or questions? Perfect. Okay. Just like always, feel free to cut me off in the middle. So I'm going to share my screen here, and just to have two introductory sources just to frame our conversation today. Again, I don't think either of these first two sources, or even the majority of these sources, I doubt will be new to a lot of people here. But just to sort of review, to talk about the story of the Exodus, which, just to give the 20-second reminder of what the wider story is, right? The story of the Israelites descending into slavery in Egypt. And the main inflection point of the story is a God who cares enough to bring them out, which is something we say over and over again during the Haggadah. Actually, if you read, one of the interesting things that the Haggadah is very careful to keep driving home, which at first glance seems surprising why the Haggadah is so obsessed with it, is there's probably 5 or 6 different times where we say, God, not a messenger, not an angel, not an advocate, not a seraph. And this happens throughout the Haggadah, as if the main point of the Haggadah, to some extent, is to drive home the message that this is a situation where God's self, cares enough to bring this group out from slavery to freedom, which, of course, for an ancient world, where oftentimes conceptions of divinity were used in the opposite way, namely, in the ancient world, the use of divinity was actually used to preserve hierarchy, meaning if I happen to be the king of Assyria or Egypt or Babylonia or Canaan, the reason why I'm king must be because God likes me better than you, or must be because I'm God and you're not, right? The Exodus inverts that, right? The Exodus says specifically the opposite, that God actually is there to basically tell a universal truth, which is all hierarchy is a facade, right? Anytime you have a situation where it seems like some humans are more powerful, richer, more important than another human, that's just a facade, and really at the root, right, this core idea of Judaism that all humans are created in the image of God, right, that is the idea of the Exodus. And so we see how this story, of course, has been used over and over again in history to be a powerful metaphor or an analogy for moral good. So just two interesting examples, right? And this is the famous Martin Luther King Jr. speech, I've been to the mountaintop, which of course is probably one of the most powerful speeches in modern history. And he specifically gives this example. And so he says, something is happening in Memphis, something is happening in our world. And if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of a general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on towards the promised land. And so just the use of this story, right, as an entire framework, as something that we already, and this is something that, of course, Jewish sources have alluded to even thousands of years before this speech, but the idea that when we're commemorating the Exodus, we're not talking about history here. I mean, to some extent, right, we can talk all we want about the history of the Exodus and about, the various academic debates there, but when we talk about the Exodus in Judaism, we're talking a lot more about the present and the future than we are talking about some situation that happened 3,400 years ago. And the Exodus is something that has to be constantly unfolding. Just one other preliminary speech, this might be a little bit less well known, but it's equally important and interesting, is David Ben-Gurion, of course, the first prime minister of Israel, was at the UN Commission on Palestine in 1947. And this is one of the first times that the UN all got together, and he was making the case for the state of Israel. And he decides to use Passover as his example. And here is what he says. He says, 300 years ago, there came to the New World a boat, and its name was the Mayflower. The Mayflower's landing on Plymouth Rock was one of the great historical events in the history of England and in the history of America. But I would like to ask any Englishman sitting here on the commission, what day did the Mayflower leave port? What date was it? I'd like to ask the Americans, do they know what date the Mayflower left port in England? How many people were on the boat? Who were their leaders? What kind of food did they eat on the boat? More than 3,300 years ago, long before the Mayflower, our people left Egypt. And every Jew in the world, wherever he is, knows what day they left. And he knows what food they ate. And we still eat that food every anniversary. And we know who our leader was. And when we sit down to tell the story to our children and grandchildren in order to guarantee it will never be forgotten. And we say our two slogans, now we may be enslaved, but next year we'll be a free people. And it's this incredibly powerful, right, analogy, basically trying to tell the powers in the world that were obviously there in 1947, how rich of a identity and a tradition we have. And I don't think it's a mistake that David Ben-Gurion, again, a committed Jew, but also at the same time, a secular Jew, right? David Ben-Gurion was not, a religious Jew. He was asked about God and he famously sort of shrugged his shoulders, but he was a Jew that was enriched in Jewish tradition. And he uses Passover as the quintessential Jewish moment of saying, this is our story. This is a story that, again, both gives us a sense of identity in the past and also gives us imperatives moving forward. And so with these two sources in mind, again, we sort of get this dialectic that's already rising here between all of Judaism and Passover in general. And this is a question that I think, to some extent, all Jews involved in Jewish communities should be asking themselves, namely, is what we're doing as a community, are we doing it for us or are we doing it for the world? And ultimately the answer should be both, but it's complicated to get at an answer that says both. Taking a stop here so next we'll look at some Passover sources, but I would love to hear anyone's thoughts on sort of these two different ways in which I think the story of the Exodus has been used. Again, one, Martin Luther King's version, which is a deeply universalistic reading of the story, which is, this is a story for for everybody for all time and teaching universal truths. And David Ben-Gurion's, who is using it as a much more particularistic, right? This is a story of our people. This is a heritage of our people. And, obviously, here's why our people deserve, whatever he was arguing. I would love to throw that out to get some thoughts.
I have a question, Daniel. On Martin Luther King, he said God's children. Was that too narrow? He didn't say Jews.
It's a great question. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why he chose God's children as opposed to Jews, but even, I guess, maybe to add to your point, he might have been purposely universalizing it, right?
Yeah.
Because already, if you say Jews, right, it makes it seem like the story is happening for one people, right? He's choosing to read the story, which is not an incorrect reading, right? I don't want to malign his reading, but he's reading it in a way that is very specifically, God is saying no more, no more slavery, as opposed to, right, a more narrow reading, which is God is saying no more Jews dwelling in Egypt in, 3,300. Barbara, go for it.
I've never heard the Ben-Gurion speech, and I tell you, I'm really impressed with how he made his point. It was really brilliant. I don't know whether I'd ever be able to have tied those issues together, but he did it brilliantly.
Yeah, it's a really great speech. I'll try to a little bit later find the link to the whole thing, because I think he goes on a bit. And what's interesting, I mean, from a historical perspective, he's also correct. Meaning, Passover is the oldest Jewish tradition that we have. I mean, from all, from both the literalist reading of the Torah, right? It's the first thing that's actually commanded to the Israelites as a nation, right? One of the ironies that we'll see a little bit later, and one of the things in which has stumped many a medieval Bible scholar, is the commandment to celebrate Passover happens before the Exodus happens. And so it's one of the really interesting things. We'll see it in the source later, but there's this great moment where Moses gathers all of the Israelites. They're packing, they're getting ready to leave Egypt. And Moses tells them, hey, by the way, here, we can actually go to this, or we'll go to the source in a little bit. Moses tells them, hey, by the way, next year, when you're doing this again, your kids are going to ask you, why are you doing this? You tell them it's because God led me out of Egypt. And virtually any scholar that's ever read the Torah in sequence has said, well, that happened before the Exodus, right? So one provocative reading, I didn't bring the source, but there was a Jewish thinker named Yosef Yerushalmi who wrote a famous book called Zachor, or Memory. And he basically tries to argue that, or he has this provocative line that says that the Exodus happened so that we can remember it, rather than we remember it because it has happened. But basically, he's advocating for the exact way that both Martin Luther King and David Ben-Gurion use the story, which is the whole point of the story is to create analogy and apply it to modern events. And if it just happens to be a story that sits in our Haggadah that for 1 or 2 nights a year, we, dust off and have to look for and crack it open and read, what a great story. And then the next day we go on with our normal lives, right? To some extent, what they're both arguing here, and what the Haggadah also ultimately argues, is that there's something being missed. And I see that there's a comment that in there's a lot of songs about the Exodus and parallel of freedom from slavery there, right? There's a famous song, Go Down Moses. And so there's certainly a lot there. So just to and of course, if there's more questions or comments, feel free to interrupt. So just to go back to a source that I think everybody here is familiar with, but just painted in slightly different light, we have this tension in our tradition between whether or not our story is particular or our story is universal from the outset. I mean, it's one of these great, one of the great tensions of Jewish identity. And ultimately, I think it's really good to have this tension. If I wasn't clear about that in the beginning, I apologize, but I think having this tension between particularism and universalism is very good and very healthy. Because if you swing all the way to the particularist side, you adopt a mentality of I only care about my in-group, and everybody else, who cares what happens to them? And if you adopt too much of a universalist mentality, you end up thinking, well, I have my ideology and I need to spread that at all costs. And so very quickly, I think, having a balance and having, whenever you become too particularist, you get knocked with this dose of universalism saying, well, wait a minute, you have to care about the world. And the second you start thinking, I have the sole solution for how to fix the world, which has never worked in human history, you get this dose of particularism saying, oh, wait a minute, not so fast, right? Like matzah is just for you, right? You don't need to knock on your neighbor's door and try to force feed them matzah. So we have this from the outset because, of course, the beginning of our story starts with Abraham and Avraham. Even the name, right? If you parse Avraham in Hebrew, it quite literally means father of nations, or father of the nation, depending on how you want to read it. And so Abraham becomes sort of a metaphor for Judaism and the Jewish mission. And so the first time God is calling out to Abraham, right? God says to Abraham, go forth from your native land, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who curse you and curse the ones who, I will bless those who bless you and curse the ones who curse you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And so God is telling Abraham this very cryptic message. Basically, you are forging your own identity, right? Separate out from whatever's happening in the ancient world, right? Obviously, the rabbis and the midrash have a field day with imagining, Abraham rebelling against idols and all of these ideas. But just from the base Torah text, you're forging your own identity, right? You're going to be a nation, right? So a nation means you are separate, right? That is a particularistic idea. But also there's going to be this idea of, right, everybody else is going to bless themselves by you. And so we have this tension at the outset, which is what is Abraham's mission? Is his mission, on the one hand, to cultivate a strong personal group identity and worry about his children and his grandchildren, as is mainly the story throughout Genesis of obviously Abraham and Sarah caring about Isaac and then Jacob and then the 12 tribes, and Genesis to some extent is a very particular message. On the other hand, one could equally argue that one of the things in which the Torah alludes to the fact that Abraham and Sarah did, and of course the Midrash adds on to this, this direction, is that no, Abraham and Sarah actually were the epitome of universalism because they had this, right, this famous idea of the tent that was open in 4 places, and they were always having guests, and everywhere they went, they were trying to spread, right, certain ideas. And so we have this tension, which again creates a complex worldview that isn't as simple as Abraham is only supposed to care about his children and grandchildren, or Abraham is supposed to care about the entirety of the world. And so this is not something new to Jewish tradition. This is something I can imagine Abraham, or at this point still Abram, I can imagine him being very confused as he's walking away from Ur to the land of Israel, thinking to himself, well, wait a minute, what am I actually supposed to be doing, right? Am I supposed to be cultivating strong tribal identity, or am I trying to be spreading a message to the world? The reason why this comes to the forefront of Passover, and again, just to do 2 of the most important Torah sources of Passover, and then 2 rabbinic sources, and then just a couple sources in conclusion, and then again, feel free to cut me off at any point. This is the source I alluded to before, by the way. So this is the first time that Passover is mentioned in the Torah. And for those who are counting, right, this is in Exodus 12, which is before they actually leave Egypt. So this is Moses telling the Israelites, you should observe Chag HaMatzot, right, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day, I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout the ages as an institution from all time. In the first month, which according to the Bible is Nisan, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day in the month at evening. And it shall come to pass when your children say unto you, what do you mean by the sacrifice? Meaning, what the heck are you doing? You should say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for that he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses, and the people bowed their head and worshipped. And so this is, of course, both the origin of why our holiday is called Passover, because of the source, And also this sort of irony that I alluded to before, which is before the story even happens, the thing that seemingly Moses is most concerned about isn't, did you pack enough socks for this 40-year journey we're about to do? It's how are you actually going to, what are you going to say in 40 years from now when you have children and your children are confused about what you're doing? And so this is why, by the way, the entire framework of the way that the Haggadah is set up is specifically with an intent to teach, right? The entire framework of the Haggadah, right? We have the framework of the 4 questions, which are, of course, right? Questions are the best way to get somebody, especially children, interested in something, right? You don't just sit around and you're eating, parsley dipped in salt water. You say, well, why are we doing this? In a very, funny and theatrical way. We have the framework of the 4 children who ask the different types of questions, right? So the whole thing gets framed as, right, the purpose of the Seder is almost a ritual theater to some extent, where the goal of the Haggadah is to make sure that the next generation understands what's going on. And so this becomes, again, one of the chief, I guess, particularisms of Passover is the important part of the story is that the story gets passed down. And so one of the ironies are, and I would actually love to hear some thoughts, but the way that I've started thinking about Passover is, right, on the one hand, if the important part of the Seder is that you're passing it down, right, the next question to ask is, okay, well, what does it contain in it, right? Are we packaging it with any value? And so the way in which I've come to think of the Seder, and I think this might be a bigger way to understand ritual in the Jewish community, is ritual to some extent are capsules by which we can package ideas in a way that actually sticks. And so one other way to think about that is the idea of wanting to add freedom to the world, or the meta story of Passover, which is an extremely important and a true one, right? That we should always be trying to right injustice, and we should always be looking out, and what are the modern day analogies to slavery, right? How do we, right? What are the exoduses that still need to happen? Those are the universal ideas. But one of the things in which doesn't work is you can't pass down universal ideas from one generation to another. They're too vague. They don't stick to anything, right? You can't tell a 9-year-old, metaphysical ideas about freedom and slavery and the importance of being an advocate for good. I mean, you could probably tell them, but it'll probably go in one ear, out the other. So what Jewish tradition has very smartly done is come up with all of these particularistic rituals as a way to capture these complex ideas and package them in a very straightforward way that anybody can understand, right? We all have an idea, and for people who grew up having Passover Seders, we all remember the first time we tasted maror, or the bitter herb, or we all remembered what it's like to sort of try to get down that next piece of matzah when you're at the Seder. And so we see this balance already coming out at the outset. I would love to open this up. I'll even unshare my screen to add to potential conversation. I would love to hear some thoughts about this dialectic and this balance between the ritualization of things in Judaism, which are merely means to an end, and the wider ideas that are to some extent an end in itself. I'd love to hear pushback. Would love to hear anything at all.
Well, I wanted to go back a little bit to what you were saying about the particular versus the universal. And that's what we've been talking about in Torah study at the, or toward the end of Deuteronomy, where what is the importance of the people following what's in the Torah. And part of it says, because if you do, everything will go well for you, that your life will be really good. But other sections say, because you want to bring glory to God, and God wants, you will be a light that shines among all the nations, and they will see, how blessed you as a people are, and how blessed this whole system then is, and Adonai is. And so that again is the complexity of the two concepts.
Yeah, I love that, Cindy. Yeah, and Deuteronomy, I mean, yeah, Deuteronomy is a really interesting case study there because that whole history to some extent, I mean, Isaiah picks up on this a lot more, where he specifically tries to take all of these particular things and universalize it in ways. I mean, our tradition is full of this tension, and one of the most famous areas of this tension at the end of Isaiah, right? This has become famous, a part of the liturgy for high holidays, where we say, "V'haviyoti el har kachi v'simachti b'beit tefillah," right? God will bring us back to Israel, and all of the nations will now come to Jerusalem. And anybody looking at that is like, wait, where did that come from? Right? We take this, temple, which is supposed to be particularistic in the first temple, and then now it's somehow become universal. And of course, one way in which to read that is in an extremely messianic way, which is to say, right, but another way to read that without resorting to messianism, which has never turned out well for any of its proponents when actually tried to be implemented, is to say that no, it actually is trying to keep this balance.
Raise your hand.
Any other thoughts, Jerry? Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say this provides a good framework to answer the questions where a number of religions demand not just that you follow their ethical path or a universal path, but that you also be observant of their, it requires down to, you have to have the correct beliefs that their religion requires. And Judaism, this gives a framework to explain to people Judaism does not call that all people have to be observant. That's a particular thing that the Judaism calls on its adherents, that they should observe these laws. But those are for the Jews, and we don't demand that other people do that. But the demand that everybody obey ethical strictures is within the framework. And we do call on all people to do that. And it provides a good framework for why we say it's fine for us to follow this path. You don't have to. It's not required of everybody. But if you do, we were chosen to follow this path ritualistically as well. But others are required to follow the general rules of ethics.
Yeah, I love that. I think one Jewish thinker joked, I'm trying to remember who the name is, but they joked, I don't care if you believe in God or not. I just believe that you care that God created all humans in the image of God. Which I think sums it up well, which is, and this is also true, of course, for internal Jewish community, right? There's no theological litmus test for any Jewish community. I mean, it's just not been something that the Jews have done, but there are, of course, ritualistic or ethical litmus tests for Jewish community. And so, right, people would be a lot more upset, I think, rightfully so, if somebody was doing something or acting in a way that's contrary to Jewish values, than if somebody, admitted, on Rosh Hashanah evening that, I'm a little more agnostic about this God sitting there and judgment thing. Mark, were you going to say something? Okay, awesome. So let's continue on a little bit. Okay, so we have just so we can see that the source comes again. Cindy predicted the end of the source sheet here. So Deuteronomy, of course, reiterates this situation, right? Deuteronomy, or the book of Devarim, happens 40 years after the Exodus, and so now we are actually, right, this is when this idea actually gets implemented, which is interesting, where presumably from the setting of Deuteronomy, the entire nation who actually experienced the Exodus, minus Moses and the people who happened to be babies during the Exodus, they have all died out purposely. And so all of a sudden now Moses is telling the children of the people who experienced the Exodus. And here is a great answer, right? So now Moses is reiterating this idea, and he says, your son is going to ask you, or your child is going to ask you in time, saying, what are these testimonies, the statutes, and the ordinances which the Lord your God had commanded you? Which, of course, that becomes the question of the wise child at the Passover Seder. And the answer that Moses tells them to give is, you should say to your child, we were Pharaoh's bondsmen in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. right? So a very easy, straightforward answer, until we unpack this a little bit and we realize that Moses is telling a generation that were never actually slaves, because by definition, the generation that he's talking to in Deuteronomy were not the people who left Egypt because they were forced to wander until they died out. You tell your children you were slaves. And so already the Torah is prescribing this idea, which obviously the Talmud and the Haggadah pick up on, which is in every generation, a person has to regard themselves as though they had personally gone forth from Egypt. And so it's not enough to tell this story as a very long time ago, a bunch of Israelites, happened to be in Egypt and God came and rescued them, right? The whole framework of the story is reliving it in a way that's tangible enough for these ideas to actually stick. And so it's one thing to read something in a history book about an injustice that happened a very long time ago and how it was mitigated. And I think the subtext here, and this is something that, happens all too often, is whenever people read history, I think that there's, and I of course do this just as much as anybody, there's a present bias that we have when we read things that happened 1,000 years ago and we sort of laugh to ourselves, wow, they were terrible back then. I'm so glad that our morals are so much more heightened than they were in 800 CE, which of course societal's morals are heightened, and that's a good thing. It means history is progressing. But on the other hand, right, in 1,000 years from now, they're going to be looking at us with those same framework until we obviously create a more perfect world, however one wants to define that. And I think the Passover experience is trying to prescribe that idea and try to say, right, it's not enough to understand, right? We can all easily understand what ancient Iron Age slavery was like, right? When the world was full of hierarchy and everything like that. It might be a little bit harder to look in modern society and to try to unpack, well, what are the situations today that in 3,000 years, when there are scholars of ancient America and they're looking at what was happening in the 21st century, what are the things that they're going to read and they're going to say, wow, this was a terrible situation, right? Who was thinking about this? And so every generation, just like MLK and just like Ben Gurion, sort of use this story for a present sense, right? Obviously, a huge part of the Passover Seder is to prescribe that retelling. So I wanted to just do two sources in summary. I see that there was a comment in the chat. So this is one of my favorite sources. So Heschel ends up making it onto probably half the source sheets that I do, because he is well deserving of that place. So Heschel, in his book, The Sabbath, famously talks about the importance of holidays also. And this is, I think, just has always been one of the most powerful sources to explain the move that Judaism made. Just to give a little bit of introduction to this, is one of the things in which Judaism brought to really the world wasn't just ethical ideas, right? Or ethical monotheism, as we might call it, right? So it's not just the idea that, well, if you believe that there's one God as opposed to 50 gods, that also means one God created everything, which also means the God that created me is the God that created, all of you. Therefore, right, why would I consider myself any better or any worse than you? Because we were all, again, created from one source. That also came with a certain view of history. And one of the things in which a lot of scholars of religion or scholars of the ancient world unpack, which is, right, how one views time. And this is obviously right, there's two foundational ways to view time. We can view time as cyclical, or we can view time as linear. We obviously can try to do both, which Judaism, again, right, whenever forced with a black and white decision, Judaism usually says we'll take both, right? Obviously, our calendar is cyclical, but our view of time is linear. But what that means is nature, to a large extent, is cyclical, right? Any way in which one could keep track of time using a natural, obvious natural bodies, are going to be cyclical, right? So the day and the month and the year. And so you can imagine in a lot of ancient communities, the way in which time was conceptualized was almost as Ecclesiastes, right? The famous line of Ecclesiastes, right? The sun rises, the sun sets, nothing changes, right? Generation comes, generation goes, the earth stays the same, right? This sort of very nihilistic attitude, which suggests that maybe everything is just the same because the sun is going to set at 7 today and it's going to rise the next morning, and it seems like everything might be the same. And so what Heschel argues, and what a lot of other Jewish thinkers argue, is that there was a pivotal moment in ancient Jewish history where there's this switch from cyclical to linear. And actually, a very careful reading of the Torah suggests this also, because all of our holidays, including Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, right, all of the big holidays started out as agrarian holidays. And so if you actually try to tease out, well, where is the origins of the holiday of Passover, or where are the origins of the holiday of Sukkot or Shavuot, right? It turns out that a lot of the time in which the Torah talks about these holidays, they were based on an agrarian cycle, which was common to basically all peoples in the ancient world, right? All religious holidays were connected to the natural cycle in some way until this moment. So Heschel says, one of the most important facts in the history of religion was the transformation of agricultural festivals onto commemorations of historical events. The festivals of ancient peoples were intimately linked with nature seasons. They celebrated what happened in the life of nature in the respective seasons. Thus, the value of the festive day was determined by the things nature did or did not bring forth. In Judaism, Passover, originally a spring festival, became a celebration of the exodus from Egypt. The Feast of Weeks, an old harvest festival at the end of the wheat harvest, became the celebration on the day in which the Torah was given at Sinai. The Feast of Booths, an old festival of vintage, commemorates the dwelling of the Israelites in booths during their sojourn in the wilderness. To Israel, the unique events of historic time were spiritually more significant than the repetitive processes in the cycle of nature, even though physical sustenance depended on the latter. And so there's this pivotal moment where if all we care about, and one of the reasons why Jewish holidays have this sort of dualistic nature of being both agrarian and also historical, is if all we care about is the material goods or materialism of the holiday, then all we care about is the agrarian element. But one of the things in which Passover specifically does is injects this wider historical understanding. And one of the ways in which this leap is made is every year we get together and we say, if God had not taken us out of Egypt, we still would have been there. Which, right, you can debate at your seders whether or not that is a true historical statement or a metaphorical statement. But what that's in a sense saying is there are times in history where if you do things, they have effect that actually changes the trajectory of history. And so it posits a worldview that is not one that says, well, nothing matters, do whatever you want, right? It's a worldview that suggests that no, you can actually make a difference in the future of the world by changing things now, just as thousands of years ago, there were decisions made that had an effect. And so again, Passover becomes the archetype of this idea, which again, represents really everything we do in Judaism. And I just want to finish it off with one source. And then of course, we can have conversation for the next couple minutes until people have to leave. This is echoed by Marcia Eliade, who was he was a well-known religious thinker in the 20th century. I don't believe he was Jewish, but his writing is fascinating. He writes a lot about the idea of mythical understandings of time. And I really love this. I mean, this is from a wider essay, but I think this really rings true. And so he writes, in certain highly evolved societies, the intellectual elites progressively detach themselves from the patterns of traditional religion. The periodical re-sanctification of cosmic time then proves useless and without meaning. But repetition emptied of its religious content necessarily leads to a pessimistic vision of existence. When it is no longer a vehicle for reintegrating a primordial situation, that is, when it is desacralized, cyclical time itself becomes terrifying. It is seen as a circle forever turning on itself, repeating itself to infinity. And so just to briefly summarize, and then we can conclude and have some conversation, right? What he's in a sense saying is that you need the boundaries of time, what we in Judaism call holidays, right? Or days that are holy, right? And holiness just means something that's separated. So all it means when we say that Shabbat is a holy day or Passover is a holy day is that we all have an intuitive understanding that next Wednesday night is not going to be like last night. That last Wednesday night was, a random, what in Judaism we call chol, which it doesn't mean, right? It's just neutral to some extent. And next Wednesday night will be called a Yom Tov, right? Or a good day or a holy day, however we want to say it, is not that, right? It's not that the primary importance is that there is a ritual that has to be done on a certain day, right? What I think both Heschel is arguing against and Eliade is arguing against is almost the opposite. It's that if you want to have ideas and a framework of the world, and you want those ideas to actually mean anything and to matter and to be motivating factors, not just for yourself, but the next generation and the generation after, right? Ad infinity, right? You actually need to constrict this into something, right? To constrict it into certain times, right? That break up the sort of seemingly infinite nature of the world, or into rituals, which again, the point of a ritual is to do something that necessarily breaks the normal order, right? A ritual is you're taking something that seemingly is normal, right? The most famous example is matzah, right? If I were to eat a piece of matzah today, that might be considered, a bad lunch. Whereas if I eat matzah next Wednesday night, I am doing a mitzvah, right? I'm doing a ritual act. And so it's not that the eating of matzah is anything necessarily special, but it's that we have demarcated certain times and certain things that are particularistic ideas to then use as a vehicle to understanding our wider place in the world and society. I would love to hear any thoughts and reflections. For anybody who wants to keep glossing over the sources, I will throw it into the chat. But I would love to hear any and all thoughts about Passover, about the Seder, about anything we discussed in the last 50 minutes. All right, I put the.
All right, I'll say something.
Yeah, go for it.
If you're going to try to, so in thinking about Passover, you're trying to teach something moral. You're trying to create a more moral situation and it's stressed throughout Torah that this is something really done for the children, because you have a short period of time in youth to try to teach morality. I listened to a guy talk yesterday. He says really by about the age of 4, it occurs. And if you haven't taught certain lessons by that time, it's never going to happen. And Passover is a time to try to teach something that I would consider, I use the word empathy. All right. If you want to teach empathy to a child, what you do is you say, look, like say you wanted to teach them that cats are kind, you should love a cat. I'll just give you that example. You're going to give them a cat. They're going to fall in love with the cat. And then when they hear that people are abusing cats, they're going to go, how could they ever do that? I could just use my daughter as an example. We had a slew of animals here on our property, and really they absolutely love animals, my children, because they had animals that they love. So if they see injustices being done to animals, they would look and say, this is horrible. All right, so how do you teach children to empathize with moral concepts? All right, so you say you're a slave, right? And you talk about slavery, and even little kids as they grow up, you could teach them what slavery and the abuses, and would you ever treat another human that way? And so the whole, one of the points of the entire story here is just to try to teach to empathize with a situation that hopefully you'll carry into your adulthood, to look at other human beings as something that you shouldn't want to treat as a slave. And that's something that I was thinking about as you were talking earlier. And then the very last quote you had there about the periodic, about re-sanctification of a holiday year. Yeah, if you look at today's society with a bunch of the young people who really feel there's no love, there's no reason for anything. I mean, you see these school shootings. I grew up, there was never a school shooting. There were just as many guns, but there was never school shootings. That was a very odd thing to have people walk in and start slaughtering other people, right? They don't see a beginning or an end or anything to anything. Wednesday is just yet another Wednesday. And the situation that our world has come to, I think in some ways, at least with some people, and what I read, it's a lot of young people in their depression is they don't have anything to grasp to. Next Wednesday is a meaningless day to them, just as this Wednesday was, just as next year this Wednesday will be. And just like that last guy's quote, it was a man, right? Okay. His quote was saying, it just goes on into infinity of nothingness. So why should anybody care?
Yeah, I think, by the way, I think that last point that you made is the most important thing. And I think it's almost sad because you'll have conversations with, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, you know, I don't want to stereotypically blame young people for this, although 99% of this, it is, right, a generational thing where, you know, things that are obviously they want to do or things that are tough, right? Let's say, I mean, the amount of research, let's say, on social media use in middle schoolers and high schoolers, and even to some extent college students is crazy. I mean, the amount of hours in which the average 13-year-old is on TikTok and Instagram and websites and stuff like that. And so you say, well, wouldn't it be nice if you had some time where you weren't on social media? And the answer is, well, yeah, anytime that I want to stop being on social, right? Sort of the classic, right? I can quit whenever, but when does that time come? Well, I never feel like it. As opposed to some extent, if you have a prescribed day every week or a prescribed holiday every year that says, hey, this is a day in which you actually are not supposed to be, you know, let's say using social media, right? Let's say Shabbat, right? It's almost a lot easier, right? And then you can start to build that framework in which you can actually separate time and you can have some sense of this day is different and you can build up on something. And so, yeah, I think there's sort of, there's so much of everything in society now that people can't grasp onto anything. And so paradoxically, to some extent, trying to create, right, the only way to actually build something is to, you know, have walls and have boundaries to some extent. And so this idea that and which is also a big irony, just to connect it to Passover for a second, there's an irony of freedom, right? You know, the meta story of the entire book of Exodus is one of freedom. And there's an irony where the first thing that God, right, God tells the Israelites, well, you're free. Now here's a Torah with a bajillion laws and, you know, more requests for your life. And so one sort of meta question is, well, is that really freedom? Have they just gone from one system of a bunch of rules that they have to obey to another? And one of the philosophic answers that comes out is that freedom, where you have no boundaries or no borders or no constraints, is not free in any sense. It's actually a terrible situation where just everything is chaos and, you know, you can't build anything. And so you need to get the right amount of constraints and also freedom, right? Obviously, no one wants to be living in a worldview where every second of their day is constrained. But yeah, right. I think the most basic building block, and one of the things why I think the Jewish calendar is such a central idea, is it creates those building blocks and it's set in place. And so anybody who's a part of a Jewish community knows that next Wednesday night is not a normal night. Now, whatever you do, right, there's going to be 8 million different ways in which Passover celebrated next Wednesday night, which is great. But whatever it is, it's not going to be a normal Wednesday night, right? If normally Wednesday night, one gets home from school or work and immediately, you know, turns on Netflix or something like that, right? Like next Wednesday night should not be that. So yeah, I love that point, Fred.
You know, just to add to, I was thinking about, you started out talking about Abraham, and, and I was thinking about my little cat analogy, and these are not just random people. It becomes that you were there, and these are your family. Okay, so not only do you love that cat, you love these people. These people are family to you, and they've really stressed in these stories how, when they always say everyone was at Sinai, and when you convert with a new family, they give you the name Ben and Bat, Abraham and Sarah, that you're actually part of a family that then you feel connected and tied to, as opposed to you're just another believer. No, it's like, you're not a believer. And if you said, like you could probably take Mark, and Mark probably has and I've listened to him talk when he talks about Holocaust things and his parents, he is deep, he feels it in his heart more than someone else, because and he was never there in Europe at the time, but Mark feels it in a way that I don't think some of us can feel. You know, my Aunt Della wouldn't tell me one iota of what went on to her in Europe and just didn't want to talk about it, right? So, you know, there's things that, you know, that whole familial thing of like saying Abraham is part of it and we're all part of that. You know, to me, it's a real connection with a group of people that, and you start telling children that at a young age, these are your family members, right? It doesn't seem so long ago, as say 3,000 years ago. It's like, oh, Abraham's, you know, he's like grandpa, right, to them. And then they connect with that. And there's a certain, it puts it in your heart where then hopefully you create a more moral group of people. I mean, if this is for the children, it's a brainwashing. I mean, I don't want to use that term, but it's really, you're trying to convince people that when they grow up, that something becomes inside of them that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's how I always view, or not always, but that's what I've come to believe in some ways the Passover story is about.
Yeah, I love that. I see it's 2, so if anybody needs to leave, don't feel awkward. Leave. Zoom is always one of those things that feels awkward to leave if people do, but I'm happy to keep the conversation going. But if people do need to go, feel free. Shirley, were you going to say something?
Yes, Fred talked about the shootings, and President Biden said, and I don't hate President Biden, I like him, I think he's good. He said he can't do anything about it. And they said the GOP isn't going to do anything about guns. But I'm a little confused that he's saying he can't do anything about it, because obviously he can. And this was the Nashville, the Tennessee, the new one.
Mark, are you trying
I've got to go, but happy Passover, everyone.
Happy Passover.
Happy
Take
Passover.
care.
Good say, Pesach.
Bye-bye.
Shirley, I think you'll onset the Passover Seder spirit of good family political argument a little early.
Well, just with Martin Luther talking about the slavery and, you know, the
Yeah.
hatred that's going on, it's so strong. And here we're in 2023. And I mean, to treat people horribly, it's not right. I mean, I know there are a lot of injustices.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean,